Nobody expected the hearing to begin like this. For weeks, Republicans had promised tough questions. Supporters of former President Donald Trump said this would finally be the moment Dr. Anthony Fauci would have to answer for years of controversy surrounding the government's response to COVID-19. The hearing had already become one of the most anticipated political events on Capitol Hill, with cameras lined up outside, lawmakers trading accusations before the first question was even asked, and millions of Americans waiting to see what would happen. Then the room fell quiet. As questioning began, Fauci's legal team made it clear that, on the advice of counsel, he would invoke his constitutional right under the Fifth Amendment in response to many of the committee's questions. The decision immediately changed the tone of the hearing. Republican senators argued that the public deserved direct answers after years of debate over pandemic policy, research funding, and government transparency. Democrats pushed back just as forcefully, saying the hearing had become a political spectacle and that invoking the Fifth Amendment is a constitutional right, not an admission of wrongdoing. Within minutes, what many expected to be a dramatic confrontation turned into something very different: a battle over law, politics, and public perception. That distinction mattered. Supporters of the hearing argued that Americans had waited long enough for accountability. Critics countered that the investigation risked turning complex public health decisions into partisan theater. The disagreement wasn't simply about Fauci anymore. It had become another front in the broader political fight over COVID-19, government trust, and the legacy of one of the most divisive periods in modern American history. As the exchanges intensified, every statement and every refusal to answer became a headline of its own. For many Americans watching, the hearing wasn't just about Anthony Fauci. It represented years of unanswered questions, political division, and lingering frustration over decisions made during the COVID-19 pandemic. Republican members of the committee argued that public confidence had been damaged by conflicting guidance, shifting policies, and the government's handling of scientific information. They maintained that officials who played central roles during the pandemic should be willing to explain those decisions publicly and in detail. But the hearing took a different direction almost immediately. As senators pressed forward with their questions, Fauci repeatedly relied on his constitutional right to remain silent on the advice of his attorneys. The Fifth Amendment allows witnesses to decline to answer questions if they believe their responses could potentially be used against them in future legal proceedings. That decision instantly became the story. Republican lawmakers said the American people expected answers, not silence. They argued that years of public debate over lockdowns, vaccines, federal research funding, and communications with health agencies made transparency more important than ever. Democratic senators saw it differently. They emphasized that invoking the Fifth Amendment is a constitutional protection available to every American. They argued that exercising that right should not automatically be interpreted as evidence of guilt or misconduct, pointing out that courts have long recognized the privilege as a fundamental safeguard. The disagreement quickly shifted beyond the witness table. Commentators across television and social media began offering sharply different interpretations of what had just happened. Supporters of the hearing described the moment as politically significant because it prevented lawmakers from getting the testimony they had hoped for. Critics argued that much of the public discussion ignored the legal realities facing any witness advised by counsel to remain silent. Meanwhile, outside the hearing room, reactions poured in almost instantly. Political allies of President Donald Trump said the hearing reinforced their calls for greater scrutiny of pandemic-era decisions. Others argued the focus should remain on improving future public health preparedness rather than revisiting every decision made during an unprecedented global crisis. That contrast highlighted the deeper divide. To one side, the hearing was about accountability. To the other, it was about constitutional rights and the limits of congressional investigations. And that debate was only beginning. As senators continued questioning witnesses and discussing the broader investigation, it became clear that the political consequences of the hearing would likely extend well beyond a single day on Capitol Hill. The arguments made inside the committee room were already shaping campaign speeches, television debates, and the broader national conversation about trust in government, science, and public institutions. The hearing itself might eventually end. The political battle over what it meant was just getting started. That became the central question hanging over Washington. What, if anything, would this hearing actually change? Congressional hearings rarely end with a single dramatic moment that settles every dispute. More often, they shape the political conversation that follows. And in this case, both parties appeared to understand that from the very beginning. Republicans argued that the hearing was part of a broader effort to examine how major decisions were made during one of the most disruptive periods in modern American history. They pointed to questions surrounding federal guidance, communications between agencies, research oversight, and the balance between scientific advice and public policy. Democrats countered that many of those issues had already been reviewed through previous investigations and public testimony. They warned that revisiting the same debates risked turning oversight into a political campaign rather than a search for new facts. That disagreement defined nearly every exchange. Each senator approached the hearing with a different objective. Some focused on accountability. Others emphasized constitutional protections. Still others argued that the country should be concentrating on preparing for future public health emergencies instead of reopening battles from the past. For viewers at home, the contrast was impossible to miss. The hearing wasn't simply about one witness. It reflected two fundamentally different narratives about the pandemic itself. One narrative argued that government officials exercised extraordinary authority during a national emergency and therefore deserved extraordinary scrutiny after the fact. The other argued that officials were forced to make difficult decisions with incomplete information during an unprecedented global crisis, and that judging those choices years later requires understanding the uncertainty that existed at the time. Those competing perspectives have shaped American politics for years. Even after the hearing adjourned for breaks, lawmakers continued making their case outside the committee room. Television cameras followed senators into the hallways, where reporters pressed them for immediate reactions. Republican members reiterated that they would continue seeking documents, testimony, and records related to their investigation. Democratic members responded that oversight should remain grounded in evidence rather than political messaging, urging the public to separate legal procedures from political rhetoric. Within hours, clips from the hearing spread rapidly across television broadcasts, online platforms, and political commentary shows. Some commentators focused on Fauci's decision to invoke the Fifth Amendment, calling it the defining image of the day. Others argued that the broader significance lay in how the hearing illustrated America's continuing divisions over the pandemic and its lasting political consequences. By the end of the day, one thing was undeniable. The hearing had become much larger than a debate over a single witness. It had evolved into another chapter in an ongoing national argument over accountability, constitutional rights, public trust, and the role government should play during times of crisis. And with more investigations, campaign speeches, and congressional battles expected in the months ahead, neither side appeared ready to let the issue fade from the national spotlight. As the hearing came to a close, one reality became increasingly clear. Neither Republicans nor Democrats walked away believing they had changed the other side's mind. Instead, each side left convinced that the hearing had reinforced its own argument. For Republicans, the hearing underscored their long-standing demand for greater transparency about pandemic-era decision-making. They argued that Americans still have legitimate questions about how key policies were developed, how federal agencies communicated with one another, and whether every decision was subject to sufficient oversight. For Democrats, the day's events highlighted something different. They argued that constitutional rights apply regardless of political affiliation, and that a witness's decision to invoke the Fifth Amendment should not, by itself, be treated as evidence of wrongdoing. They also emphasized that many pandemic-related decisions had already been examined through previous investigations, public reports, and congressional testimony. That disagreement is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. The COVID-19 pandemic reshaped nearly every aspect of American life. It affected schools, businesses, hospitals, elections, and the economy. Years later, many of those debates remain unresolved, making any hearing on the subject immediately politically charged. In Washington, that means every new investigation carries significance far beyond the committee room. Lawmakers know their questions will be replayed on television. Witnesses know every statement or decision not to answer will be analyzed. Political commentators know the hearing will quickly become part of a broader national conversation, and voters are left to evaluate competing claims while distinguishing between established facts, legal procedures, and political messaging. That challenge has become a defining feature of modern American politics. In an era of non-stop news coverage and social media, a single moment can dominate headlines within minutes. But headlines often capture only one piece of a much larger story. The more important questions usually take longer to answer. Will additional evidence emerge through future investigations? Will Congress pursue further hearings or legislative changes related to pandemic preparedness? Will the public's trust in institutions improve or continue to erode? Those questions remain open. What is already certain is that the hearing added another chapter to an ongoing national debate about government accountability, constitutional protections, and the lessons the United States should carry forward from one of the most consequential public health crises in modern history. And as Washington moves toward another election cycle, those issues are likely to remain at the center of political debate, ensuring that the conversation sparked in the hearing room continues long after the cameras have been turned off.